The appetite for consensus is really building, and one of the points that was made by one of the contributors at today's roundtable was cross-sectoral consensus. And I think that the urge for action is intensifying as people realise that the global tax debate is more complicated and needs sorting more urgently now than ever before. So I think we're seeing the evolution of the roundtable series into a call to action, a sense that KPMG, as the convener of the debate, has the opportunity and the necessity to step up and lead, but that people will throw their weight behind KPMG's leadership. So, for example, we're seeing it from the NGO sector, from academia, from policymakers, and even from media commentators who are saying there is a lack of leadership. There's lots of people who want to contribute. Please let us come together and find a way of building something that is more tangible. One of the conclusions, one of the recommendations that came out of today's group was to say, well, maybe there does need to be something along the lines of a World Tax Organization, though WTO may not be the best acronym for it, but how do we come together to create a supranational governing body that can actually steer us through this? Could we, for example, take all these people, and we've convened over 200 people so far within the roundtable series so far, could we convene that into some sort of standing group or standing committee that helps guide us through this process, but on a cross-sectoral basis? And I think there's something really interesting in that. And one of the things we're looking at is how can we maybe write an open letter that has the signatories from the NGO world, from the activist community, from corporate decision makers and their advisors, from policymakers and regulators, that says, here are the things we agree on, here are the things where we want to investigate more, and along the way, here is a process that we can jointly adopt, and here is an education program that takes us along the course of action too. These are really rich and interesting findings that I think will help further inform and advance the debate. Well, one of the things that was raised in the roundtable on evasion versus avoidance is that the irony is that never has the need for expertise in the tax sector been greater. Never has the need for expertise in better policy making been more acute. At the very time when experts who are best suited to solve the problems are least trusted. I defer here to the philosopher Honora O'Neill, who gave an interview in the Irish Times about a fortnight ago, and she said, I think that the talk about lack of trust in experts is somewhat overrated. So because you'd never go to a dry cleaners if you had a problem with your appendix and needed it removed. And I think we have to remind ourselves of that urgency. I mean, there's a lot of mistruth around post-truth. A lot of people were never really trusted in the first instance, so politicians, PR people, estate agents were always in the low trust category, whereas people like judges, doctors, nurses were in the high trust category. And that data over 30 or 40 or even 50 years hasn't really shifted. So sometimes we ask to get more trust from people that we never really trusted in the first instance, and maybe that's the wrong question to be asking. The right question to be asking is, what is the purpose of what we're doing, and who are the best people who can help us resolve that? Now, if corporate tax advisors are slightly less trusted than NGOs, or if NGOs are slightly less trusted than academics, or if academics are slightly more trusted than policymakers, rather than trying to do everything on a transactional bipolar basis or binary basis, let's bring those people together and let's build collective trust and collective wisdom to find better purpose and better solutions. And I think that's exactly what the Responsible Tax Project is digging at and why it's so important. So we've been looking a lot at some of the trust data, and the early findings from this are quite interesting. As you know, I wrote a book called Trust Me, PR is Dead, which looked at this relationship between the myths of trust, the fact that CEOs and politicians always think that trust is a message and not an outcome, the fact that they constantly look for a silver bullet or a magic bullet that doesn't really exist, and that somehow there is a return to old trust, as though, this is just a temporary blip. And so since publishing that 3 or 4 years ago, I've been doing a lot of thinking and examining or scrutinising some of the data, especially as we now live in what some people call the new normal and other people call the post-truth or the post-trust age. And there's some interesting findings. The first is that if you look at the long-term average of trust data, a lot of the metrics haven't really shifted. So trust in institutions, or confidence in institutions, which is how Ipsos Mori express it, those institutions being business, government and the media, for example, hasn't really changed much since the 1970s. If you take the long-term average and then plot against it, of course there are occasional blips, and President Trump and the Brexiteers in the UK are putting some of these numbers under extreme pressure, but they are, at the moment, they're blips, they're not long-term trends. So there's a flatlining in terms of trust. Second, you then have who do you trust to tell the truth? And you have people in a low trust category, people in a high trust category, and people in a mid trust category. In the low trust category, you get the usual suspects, which is normally sort of communications people, marketeers, politicians, estate agents. In the high trust category, you get judges, you get doctors, you get nurses. And then in the mid trust category, you tend to get people like me, people with peer-to-peer trust. And so again, the truth tellers have been pretty consistent over the period of time. For both those categories, the flatliners and truth tellers, what we have seen, however, is a massive increase in the amount of noise around trust. So if you overlay a graph of the chatter of trust, or the media coverage of trust, you get this incredible spike, which culminated in 2016's word of the year being post-truth. So there's something in there about there being a gap between what we're talking about and what we're actually experiencing. And we have to, again, sort of step back from that and ask why that is. Why are we really experiencing a crisis of trust, or are we just experiencing more noise around the society in which we live, the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and the political conditions with both a small p and a capital P that we're working through? The third dimension that we looked at is about the rise of strangers and sharers. So, trust, as John Stuart Mill wrote, is the currency. It's something that binds us all together, the glue, if you like, and that hasn't really changed. It has shifted in nature. So now we get in a car with a stranger because of transparency, and we can order it through the Uber app. We go and stay in someone else's home through Airbnb. And the rise of the sharing economy, as people like Rachel Botsman have pointed out, has been exponential. So now we're trusting strangers and sharers more so than we've ever before. So that's not to say that there's a crisis of trust, it's just that a different form of trust has emerged. But for me, the really interesting data, the ticking time bomb, if you like, is about generational trust. And if you look at trust in generations, and this is expressed, I think, best through corporations, among millennials, trust in the corporate sector, in corporations to do the right thing, 60%. Generation Z, those born between 1995, year 2000, just entering the workplace, 6%. A fall from 60% to 6%. And if you chart that out and you look at levels of trust among baby boomers, levels of trust among millennials, then among generation X, Y, and now Z, you see dropping to really quite scary levels. What this tells us is that we're living in a state of incredible fragility. And this is not surprising. Generation Z is the most anxious generation. They're the first generation that's digitally native. They can import stuff on their smartphones from all sorts of ills and worries, from suicide bombers to the global financial crisis, take your pick. And of course, they're the first generation facing a fully automated future where jobs are at risk and they may end up having to work for 70 or 80 years within the 100-year life. So their anxiety is real, but it's also affecting their trust levels. So this is something that's going to really change not just how we behave in relation to brands and to corporations, but also how we behave in terms of political institutions and the institution traditionally we've looked to solve some of the world's biggest problems.